Our story begins in a beautiful and lovely countryside town where a certain person was finishing hammering the last nail, and we are shown a large building that apparently is a restaurant, all because of the little sign there. The guy arrives and starts crying, saying, "Finally, I have my own restaurant." And that's our protagonist, the Class 9 Archmage Ellison. Look at the name of this guy, Ellison. Man, he sounds Brazilian. Ellison, Ellison, Ellison. I think I've met someone named Elle at some point. Anyway, he had been chasing this dream for 15 years. Then the famous flashback begins. Our protagonist, as always, was going to school. And it wasn't a normal school. It was a culinary school because his dream had always been to be a cook, and that's why he entered culinary college. He wanted to become a famous chef after graduating and open a restaurant when he got older. But, as always, when you're in those moments of sadness or great happiness, the legendary Troon C appears. However, instead of dying and reincarnating in another world, the protagonist was kind of teleported, and he didn't even know where he was. Like other stories, the protagonist was transported to a fantasy world that obviously wasn't peaceful. Suddenly, a guy comes up and taps the protagonist on the shoulder, telling him he should get up quickly and evacuate, or he would be killed. Not understanding anything, the protagonist began to follow them, and the most obvious thing to do when you're lost is to ask where you are. The mustached guy gets a little confused, asking if the protagonist was by any chance a foreigner, but putting that aside, he said they were in the city of Greek, on the outskirts of the Louvren Empire, and all the damage was being caused by the red dragons, which no one expected since it was a very remote area. But the protagonist hardly heard anything after the dragon part. He was totally confused. But as they say, humans are animals that adapt, so he had to find a way to accept the situation. Looking on the bright side, at least he didn't die, right? He got a second chance. The good thing is he wouldn't have to take the entrance exam or join the army after graduating. While the protagonist was there, trying to find the good points of being reborn in another world, suddenly a guy on horseback catches everyone's attention, saying that the emperor had issued a decree. The message stated that due to the fate of the nation being at stake, mercenaries having fled, and knights having fallen, there was no more place to run from those dragons. Then he started giving a very long speech, which I will summarize. The emperor ordered that everyone there, whether new or old, should fight in the name of the empire. In other words, the protagonist couldn't escape the army, but it wouldn't be just any war. It would be against dragons and magical creatures. So the recruitment system started, and the bald guy asked the protagonist if he was a relative of a high-ranking knight or a Templar knight officer, but by that point, the protagonist had lost all sense of reality and couldn't believe it anymore. Even so, he was accepted, and from then on, his life was a hell. They woke up before the sun rose and had to do absurd exercises, but at least the protagonist had an advantage. He had great magical potential, and because of that, he would be assigned to the magic course, where at least they wouldn't have to do physical exercise, right? I think. But still, whether they were in the magic course or not, they needed to eat, right? And the food there wasn't that great. Or rather, it was terrible. The potatoes tasted like cardboard and didn't even have salt. But unlike the protagonist, the people there praised the food, which of course, for a culinary college student, was very strange, making him question whether the people there had any sense of taste. But thinking about it from another angle, if he opened a restaurant there with the knowledge he had, wouldn't it be a success? And that's when the protagonist set his goal. At least the only thing that remained from his previous world was his dream. And for that, he trained. Moreover, the dragon was just a little monster, and if the protagonist worked hard, he would be quickly released. But poor guy, if he had known back then that the service time wouldn't be 2 or 3 years, his past self wouldn't be surprised to know it was 15 long years. But even so, he managed to endure it somehow. And so we return to the present time in the city of Drake. Looking at the protagonist's restaurant, a woman was completely surprised because she didn't remember there being a restaurant there, but more surprised than her was the protagonist, who couldn't stop crying. I think the woman even managed to understand a bit of the protagonist's pain because she came over and asked if he was okay, right? And the protagonist replied that he was just happy because he had finally got his restaurant, which surprised the woman. She introduced herself and her name was Rin, and instead of calling the protagonist Ellison, he introduced himself as Elle. Rin continued, saying it had been a long time since the protagonist arrived there, right? Since it was the first time she had heard of it, and the protagonist confirmed that, yes, and also he wasn't alone. He was with a friend he made in the army, but he couldn't introduce her because she sleeps a lot, so she would probably only wake up at night. But back to the conversation. The protagonist was asked by Ren if he needed a place to buy meat, and he confirmed, saying that he was actually heading to the village to see a butcher. To the protagonist's luck, Ren's husband was a butcher. So they went together, but before they left, Ren explained that her husband had a hot temper. If the protagonist found him too rude, he should just mention that she sent him there. The protagonist was happy to meet someone as nice as Ren, and even wondered how such a grumpy husband could have such a kind wife. The protagonist had spent 15 years in the army, dealing with all kinds of people, but he hadn't encountered someone like her husband before. Poor guy, he was all defensive. He started speaking as if he was being scolded by his mother, breaking his words into syllables. He couldn't even talk about the meat, and the guy already slammed the table saying he didn't sell meat. The protagonist felt awkward because there was meat right behind him. The old man started declaring that he had seen many people like the protagonist, saying they just wanted to buy cheap meat and resell it for double the price right before it spoiled. Many people had tricked him that way for 3 years, and although he didn't know the protagonist, he thought he looked just like them. Out of nowhere, he took a big hit to the head from a pan, and it was none other than Ren, declaring that he shouldn't do that or they would keep losing customers. She apologized to the protagonist for her husband's behavior and asked if he was looking for Balearan meat, which he confirmed. However, the old man wasn't too keen on selling. A couple's argument ensued, and the protagonist was caught in the crossfire, thinking he wanted to go home. In the end, as we know, the old man lost the argument and went back to work. Ren apologized to the protagonist again and explained that her husband acted that way because he once had a restaurant with his partner when he was still a mercenary. He became grumpy because he was betrayed by his friend. The protagonist didn't even realize that he was a mercenary. Ren questioned how the protagonist had figured it out since he was quite old, or if he had also been drafted. Just hearing the words recruitment and mercenary in the same sentence made the protagonist cry, remembering everything he had been through. At that moment, the old man came back and told the protagonist to show his skills. The protagonist noticed that the meat in the bag wasn't what he had asked for, and the old man started teasing the protagonist again, saying that if he were a good cook, he could make a good meal with that meat because he couldn't give him the precious Balearan meat. But I think he would regret it soon enough. What the old man was implying in a few words was that the protagonist should impress him with a dish made with that meat. The protagonist was surprised to receive that specific meat. Before the old man could say anything else, there was the legendary pan again. The protagonist asked Rin if she hadn't been a bit too harsh, but she replied that he was very resilient, so it didn't matter. Also, he was acting like a child, so he deserved to be treated like one. The protagonist said it was fine, and he would cook that meat for them, which surprised Rin. The protagonist declared that they should go to his restaurant in the evening as he would prepare a great dish with that meat. She was a bit confused as the protagonist was asking for Balearan meat, but was taking something else. However, he replied that it was enough since he already had a recipe in mind. Rin was a bit worried as that meat was the hard stomach lining of an oba. You must be wondering what that is. Calm down. We are in another world, so animals will be called different things, right? For example, cows are called uka, chickens are called palan, wolves are called buren, and pigs are known as uba. In the end, the meat the protagonist received from the butcher was nothing less than pork belly. Since we're talking about meat and other things in the protagonist's world, palan, also known as chicken, is a very expensive ingredient, and the most economical meat option is uba, which is pork, and the cheapest cut is pork belly. However, people in that world don't like pork belly much. Those of you who handle a lot of food, unlike me who can't cook anything, must be wondering what recipe the protagonist will make. Simple, grilled pork. Now, back to Rin's side. Her grumpy husband was asking what he had done wrong. Rin asked when he invented such a fancy principle as supplying meat to approved restaurants. Also, in her eyes, the protagonist seemed to be an honest and kind person, and they would just be helping a new neighbor. However, the old man still didn't believe it, as they had only known each other for a day. So Rin threw a stone at him, pointing out that he claimed to have a great eye for people but was the one who always fell for scams. The whole thing about testing the protagonist's culinary skills was just an excuse. What he really wanted to know was the protagonist's sense of responsibility, but the old man didn't want to admit it. He commented that he had a very demanding palate, and if the protagonist didn't have culinary skills up to the quality of his meat, he wouldn't sell it. In a few words, the old man was a tsundere family guy. And so, we are taken to another time, specifically during the war, where unexpected things always happened. In this case, a soldier got his leg stuck in a rock and was calling for help. At that moment, a large goblin or orc appeared, trying to kill him. But just then, someone activated their magic called Thermal Blade, causing a great flash that terrified all the monsters nearby. Now the ones buried under rocks would be the monsters. Seeing this, the soldiers were extremely surprised, and they shouted that the Class 9 Archmage Ellison was there. It didn't even seem like the same Archmage who was now making a dish with that absurdly strong magic. In a few words, each magic had its own way of being used. For example, the thermal blade could create cuts in the meat and increase the absorption of the marinade. Then the protagonist began to explain a bunch of things about cooking, which I didn't understand. Anyway, he managed to finish preparing the meat, and at that moment, Rin arrived. The protagonist said they could sit down as the food was almost ready. Rin began to compliment how organized he was, but the old man declared that the protagonist probably only tidied up because they were coming. In a cute way, Rin declared that he should stay quiet and wait for the food. She took the pan with her, showing that it was the weapon. Back to the protagonist, he started giving a tutorial. As soon as the grill was a bit hot, he should add some oil. Since pork belly was fatty, he had to add just enough to prevent it from sticking to the pan. When placing the meat, he should start with the skin side down. Otherwise, as the interior cooked, the skin could dry out, making it difficult to get an even grill. In summary, the protagonist explained a lot of things. Then he turned the meat to prevent burning, added a pinch of salt to avoid a bad taste, cut the pieces nicely, and to finish, since it was grilled, he added onions. To make the meal a bit lighter, he made a salad. In the end, he placed everything separately on the plate to make it look nice. Once again, while Rin complimented, the old man was complaining. As soon as Rin tasted the first piece, she was completely amazed and even had a vision of happy little pigs. Running through the field, she asked the protagonist if that was really oba belly, which was obvious since it was the only meat he had. Once again, he began to explain each part of the dish, and in any case, he was very happy that she was enjoying it. Rin declared that supplying him with meat would ensure she could taste his cooking again, and the protagonist thanked her. But on the old man's side, the plate was totally empty, and he was furious, even drooling, saying that the meat was gone and trembling like an old truck. The protagonist asked if he at least liked it, but as I said before, the old man, being a tsundere, replied that he didn't and that he needed much more meat. Once again, he got a big hit from the pan, and Rin declared that if he wanted to ask for more, he should do so politely, not like a hungry ogre. After having his tsundere mode beaten out of him, he returned to normal and declared that the dish was excellent. To be honest, among all the oba dishes he had tried, this one was the best. He should just inform the protagonist of what kind of meat he wanted, as he would supply the best meat from the Luverne Empire. Finally, the protagonist managed to secure a meat supplier, so he could consider his first day of business a success. Unlike the protagonist, who was doing a lot to pursue success, there was his friend, waking up at the end of the afternoon simply because of the smell of the dish the protagonist had made. We then have a time skip of a week, and since then, the protagonist announced his restaurant. People were captivated by his oba belly dish, and he was happy that the business was going well. The people who left the restaurant always praised the dishes. As he was making a lot of food, the condiments and spices ran out, and everyone should know how important these things are to a cook. Moreover, in the protagonist's world, they are extremely expensive and rare. Therefore, not everyone can use them freely. Also, the quality and variety of the products there are nothing like those of the modern world. To solve this problem, he had a special way of obtaining spices. He placed a gold coin in the middle of a circle with several engravings and then started to invoke a magic. This was how the protagonist solved his problem. He used a type of summoning magic from that world, which allowed him to bring objects from the modern world there. Coincidentally, he created this magic when he was looking for a way to return to his original world. As it is said in that world, magic depends on how someone uses it. There is also a limit to the size and weight of objects. But that magic is still a great help, It's not perfect magic, as it fails to achieve the main purpose of returning him to his original world. Since he would feel bad about just taking others' products, he always sends a gold coin in exchange. Moreover, unless they are processed products like fresh meat, eggs, or vegetables, all supplies arrive spoiled, and processed products also have expiration dates. This didn't seem to be a problem, but in reality, the protagonist doesn't know the exact reason for this. Additionally, there was another characteristic that made the protagonist incredibly exhausted. Think about it. Even he, who holds the title of ARCHMAGE, can only use this summoning once a day. Combining hunger with the desire to eat, this was the perfect time to rest while drinking beer. But there was no beer, right? I mean, there was, but it was with none other than Ruin, the black-haired woman there, sleeping. To stop her from sleeping, he flicked her on the head, and she woke up, not understanding anything. The protagonist scolded her, saying she drank all the beer without warning and left everything dirty. To defend herself, Ruin declared that it happened because the protagonist didn't leave any tasty food for her and that she was in the body of a dragon. Cleaning up the mess is something inferior beings do, not a superior being like her. However, the protagonist didn't care about that and gave her a job, peeling onions. She was very sad, as a proud dragon was doing the job of an inferior. She is really a dragon, although it doesn't seem so, as she is now in human form. The protagonist found her after she became an orphan, losing her mother and home during the war against the Red Dragons. Since he couldn't just leave her there, he decided to help her, and they've been together ever since. Even though she has lived for hundreds of years, she is still very young for a dragon, which might explain her immaturity. To motivate her, the protagonist declared that if she finished cutting all the onions, he would reward her with a nice hamburger, which, of course, made her very happy. At that moment, someone arrived at the restaurant, none other than the old butcher, whose name I just discovered is Kinol. I'll keep calling him Old Man, which is not too strange. He asked the protagonist to bring beer and some snacks, but the beer was all gone. So he found another way, and that was sake. Obviously, he changed the bottle. Otherwise, people would find it strange. He served the old man, and at first, the old man found that drink strange as it looked like water. The protagonist just told him to try it before complaining. In reality, it wasn't sake, but soju. I don't know the difference between the two. The old man was puzzled as the smell was strange, but he didn't reject it. He took the first sip and ate the food. Being a tsundere, he obviously wouldn't say it was good. He just responded that it wasn't as bad as he thought. It was bitter at first, but the sweet taste at the end harmonized with the meat, and the two together gave it a different charm compared to the salad. He even admitted that the protagonist's cooking was extraordinary, which surprised the protagonist as he was being very honest. The old man asked for another bottle, drank one more, two more, and asked for a third bottle. The protagonist told him to calm down as he was very drunk. The old man declared that he had to drink until he fell to day. The protagonist asked what he meant if something had happened. With a very sad face, the old man declared that he thought Rin was cheating on him. Hearing this, the protagonist was very surprised, and the old man began to explain that at first, she said she was going somewhere. However, it had been happening a lot lately. Every month, on a certain day, she dressed up nicely and went to visit someone. Since she had been doing this for several months, he decided to follow her, only to find out that she was meeting with one of his mercenary friends. He was a very close friend, and he had disappeared after opening the butcher shop, or so they had told him. This meant he was probably too ashamed to look him in the face because he was with Rin. She went out today, which wasn't the day she usually went out. It even seemed like she didn't care about him. Hearing all this, the protagonist tried to comfort him, saying that getting totally drunk wouldn't solve his problems. The old man responded that he didn't have to drink until he fell. But the worst part was that he still loved Rin, and even though the situation was like that, he couldn't live without her. So he didn't know what to do. The protagonist just said to leave everything to him, and even though he didn't know Rin very well, he believed she wasn't that kind of person. Back to Ruin, who was still peeling onions, the protagonist appeared and told her to stop complaining and get ready as they had a job to do. If she wanted, she could stay and peel onions, which she, of course, refused and decided to go with him. They went to the city where some kind of festival was taking place. On the rooftops, looking like bandits, were the protagonist and Ruin. He was looking around because, according to the old man at the butcher shop, Rin was in one of those fancy restaurants. Indeed, she was there, and a guy was sitting next to her, probably the friend the old man had mentioned. Now it was Ruin's turn. He asked her to listen to their conversation, but since she was a bit grumpy, she wouldn't do it for free. The protagonist knew she would ask for this, so he promised to make her 2 hamburgers. She accepted and began to relay the conversation. Rin asked if it wasn't time to tell her husband, and the guy in front of her was Mr. Mente. She mentioned that her husband was getting more suspicious of their relationship and was also sad that Mente wasn't coming to the butcher shop anymore. Mente declared that if the old man found out he helped at the butcher shop, he would avoid him. Hearing this, the protagonist was a bit surprised and confirmed with Ruin that it was exactly what Mente had said, confirming that their meeting wasn't a secret affair. The protagonist jumped off the rooftop, telling Ruin to go home and wait. He entered the restaurant, interrupted their conversation, and said that, as Rin had mentioned, the old man was misunderstanding the 2 of them. Back to the old man, he was totally drunk. At that moment, Rin and Mr. Mente arrived at the restaurant. Mente was a bit embarrassed since they hadn't seen each other for a while. The old man started getting nervous seeing them together. Rin tried to explain the situation, but the old man didn't want to listen. Thinking she was with his best friend, someone he trusted most, he wouldn't forgive him, so he prepared to fight. Mente was ready to take the punch, but at that moment, a magical barrier appeared, surprising everyone. It was no surprise that the protagonist created the barrier. He arrived, declaring that instead of fighting, they should clarify the situation. To clear up that misunderstanding, as violence wouldn't solve that problem, the protagonist simply dropped the bombshell, saying that the one who lent money to open the butcher shop was none other than Mr. Mente, which shocked the old man. The protagonist passed by him, saying he should sit at the table as he would prepare some food. Since the old man was very drunk, he decided to make a soup dish to calm his stomach. As Rin had given him Belem meat, he decided to make a shabu shabu, a very unique dish that involves cooking meat, vegetables, mushrooms, and other things. Again, the protagonist started explaining the tutorial on how to make this dish. Skipping all his explanations, he finished the meal and hoped the discussion had also ended. Returning to the discussion, the old man was asking if what the protagonist said was true, and Rin confirmed it. She mentioned that after they were left with nothing after being scammed, it was Mente who lent almost all his life savings to fund their butcher shop. Now that the shop could at least sustain itself, she met with him every month to pay off the debt. However, the old man didn't believe this story, as he had been told the money came from a castle of some lord who returned it after paying off the scammer. Mente explained that he probably wouldn't have accepted the money if he had told the truth. He also apologized for not being there when they opened the butcher shop. He didn't have much choice because if the truth came out one day, it would seem like he deceived them. However, he didn't realize the situation would escalate this much. At the moment the old man was about to start saying a lot of things, the protagonist interrupted, saying that dinner was ready. Slightly embarrassed, he apologized, explaining that the vegetables couldn't cook for too long, which was why he interrupted their conversation. And we'll see it in the next episode. Remember to subscribe and leave a like.